Okay, we'll get started again, and this is just like one more slide, kind of just continuing on the same theme as before, and then we'll start amplifying this. And I know the past half hour probably is a little bit slow. Maybe the past day and a half been a little bit slow, I don't know. At least someone laughed. All right, contract teamwork. One of the things you can also decide is, do you need help in writing specifications and contract management, etc. So obviously, this is something you need to focus on early on, because if you need help writing specifications, you can't wait until you realize you need help to try to get someone to help you if it takes, let's say, a couple months to do a procurement to get someone to help. So you need to decide what things you have to decide on first so that it doesn't hold up the rest of the process. But going through this planning stage, establish timelines. You have to say, we're going to do various things by various timelines. But as we said yesterday, they need to be realistic. You can not always just say, we're going to give it 2 weeks and it's got to be done. Sometimes you can say that, but usually it isn't going to happen, because unless it is the only thing everyone is doing, or unless it is given them as their #1 top priority, the odds are it isn't going to happen. So be realistic when you assign these time frames, because if you're not realistic, first thing that's going to happen is you're going to start missing deadline after deadline, and then what do? And if you gave assurances to someone that it would be done by a certain time frame and that wasn't realistic, then you had these people expecting things. It starts to look like you don't have credibility. You start floundering. It's best to just plan properly to begin with. Develop team member assignments. One of the benefits of having a team is that you can bring the various strengths of the various members of the team, what they know, their expertise, their sphere of influence, etc. And then you can say, okay, the MBE liaison is going to take care of the MBE part. The IT people are going to focus on the IT component. The program person is going to focus on the deliverables. And someone else is going to focus, perhaps an auditor if you have them, is going to focus on the contract management issues. So that you specifically say each member is going to do what, so they know, everyone knows what someone else is responsible for, and then what time frame for each of them to do what they're responsible for. You're going to create procurement and contract management files. Now, in the overview class, we had a 2-page, 3-page document on what goes into the procurement file. But the procurement file starts when you're doing a procurement, and in particular, the contract management file starts when you're in the planning stage. In the Perform class, we have probably 3-4 slides, probably more than that, on what goes into a contract management file. And as we said over and over and over, and I'm going to say over and over, a complete focus of what you're doing should be not just deliverables, but how you're going to manage the contract. It isn't enough to just say what the vendor is supposed to do. You have to also say how you're going to make steps to make them, or require them, or know whether they're doing what they're required to do. And you need to focus on that up front. Yes?
I find in line with this establishing timelines and stuff, when I meet with my contract teams or whatever, I took it upon myself to hand out minutes of the meetings. Everybody's on the same page. They know what dates and what was assigned to do, and then they have time to feedback and say, no, you got that wrong. But everybody there is on the same page, and it really does help.
Yes. Minutes, what she said is, minutes is very helpful, because what you find is, and I find this myself, you have a meeting, you think to yourself, okay, we all agree to exactly what, we all agree to throw things on the floor and see if they bounce. You agreed exactly on what everything was supposed to do, you made decisions, and then maybe you meet again in 10 days, and it's surprising what you forget in a little space of time. Did we agree on something? Did we even discuss that? Oh yeah, we discussed that. What did we say? And if no one has written anything down, one of the things you do is spend time rehashing things that supposedly already have been settled. So minutes is a very crucial element of any meeting of that nature. So you don't go back and waste time revisiting something that doesn't need to be revisited. Contract teamwork. Contract management plan, decide who will manage the contract. If in the perform class, the first thing we say about contract management is pick the contract manager. The very first element is figure out who's going to manage the contract, and then make sure the person that's going to manage the contract is a participant in all the other planning that goes on, so they have input into what they're going to manage. They both learn by going through the process what they have to manage, and they can give their input. And so start with the person and let them be involved. Contract management handout. Gary, did you give that out yesterday, or are you going to give it out now?
Gave out yesterday.
That's the one you gave out yesterday. And this is what's on the next couple slides, just customized a little bit for DHMH. But this is what we said is, this is something that just is a tool to focus on for who's the contract manager in some aspects of contract management in a very simplistic form. And as I've said already, great detail concerning all aspects of contract management is presented in the Perform class, 914 slides. So this is the questionnaire. All right, contract compliance checklist. This is something that I am advocating strongly now, in the future, that a focus of planning as you go through and figure out your deliverables, you should be at the same time constructing a contract compliance checklist. And what this is very simply just a listing of what the vendor will have to do under the contract, what they have to do. So it should be a description of all major deliverables, when each deliverable is due. So what is it? When is it? The criteria to validate the proper performance of applicable deliverables. How do you know when something is done? Now, if it's delivery of a piece of equipment, it's very easy to know if you got the piece of equipment delivered. If it's delivery of a public relations project, maybe it's not as easy to know when something is done. But you should say what, when, and how you're going to know whether it's been done, and specifically who is going to make the determination as to whether something's done. That is involved in the contract compliance checklist. The initial version of the checklist, the one that you do in the planning stage, should be prepared when the specifications are done, or if you have a sole source contract, when you prepare the sole source contract, because I'm saying any major contract should have a contract compliance checklist, something that goes part and parcel with the contract itself, so you know it's kind of like a check. How do you know when the vendor, what they're supposed to do, when they're supposed to do it, how they're supposed to do it, etc. And what I'm going to suggest and really emphasize is a copy of the checklist typically should be included as an attachment to your solicitation. And the reason why I say that is if you've taken the effort to construct this checklist of what you're going to look at when the contract is being performed, and if you put it in your specifications, you are automatically telling everybody who potentially is going to respond to that solicitation, you already have a plan to manage the contract. And so you're telling them, if you don't plan to really be serious about performing this contract, you better stay away and not submit a bid or proposal, because we're telling you we're going to manage this contract. The very fact that we've gone to the effort to construct this checklist. And so that's something that from my perspective is a very important conveying of a message to prospective vendors. You're serious about contract management. And there's no way that they can miss the fact that you have it included of, here's how we're going to manage the contract. Show vendors the efforts the agency will undertake to assure proper contract performance. Hopefully the inclusion of a comprehensive checklist will help convince vendors not to respond if they don't intend to fully perform, or to assure that their quoted price is sufficient to allow proper performance. The initial, and then we differentiate the initial version of the checklist that you prepare in the planning stage. And what happens with this checklist is, as you go into the procure stage, if you do an addendum that changes the deliverable, you will update the checklist. And the updated checklist can be part of the addendum that you do along with the specifications so that you keep it current. And when you go into the perform stage, when you're actually managing the contract, anything that changes, you update it so that you constantly have a current version that says what is to be done, when is it to be done, etc. And one thing that you can do after the procure stage is over, then you can put in the prices that are to be paid, because initially you can't put in what you're going to pay for each of these activities. But after you make an award, you can and you should. That's part of the update. Put in not just what's to be done and when it's to be done, but now how much is the price for each of those. Because somebody needs to look at that of when the vendor sends in an invoice, should we pay that invoice? And the first thing someone should do is compare the invoice against what was the vendor required to do. Did they do it? Did they do it within the time frame? Is it the correct price, etc., etc. Starts with a checklist. And as I said, perform, we have a fair amount of detail on that. The current version of the checklist should be referred to each time an invoice is submitted for payment so that no payment is approved unless it is verified to be appropriate in all respects. And here's another important aspect. Frequently, the contract manager changes. Whoever started out as the contract manager, maybe they went to another agency, maybe they retired, maybe they're put on another assignment and someone else is given the assignment to manage a contract. The checklist should be something that can be handed from one contract manager to a successor, and that contract manager has a very good idea of what needs to be done. Even if they weren't involved at the beginning, they have a good idea of what is supposed to be done so that they don't approve invoices unless they comply with the requirements. Each new contract manager will be able to identify what needs to be done, etc., etc. Current copies of the checklist might also be provided to accounts payable, internal auditors, other agency personnel who might help validate when payments should occur and how much they should be. In the perform class, we have two scenarios, two actual procurement scenarios, and we may only use one versus the other, where we go through an exercise of preparing a contract performance checklist. And what we do is we hand out a set of draft specifications and specifications that came into DBM from a particular agency that listed what the contract was going to require the vendor to do. And the reason why we use these as exercises is one of the things a contract compliance checklist can do is a kind of check on the adequacy of the specifications. Because in these examples, what we actually want you to do, and I'm giving away the plot line of the perform class, but hopefully in this exercise where it's, all right, prepare a contract compliance checklist for these set of specifications, what we want you to come back with and say, well, I'm not sure what to write because I'm not sure what the specifications say. And obviously, if you're preparing a checklist that is supposed to summarize for vendors what they're supposed to do, and you have difficulty figuring out what the specifications even say the vendor is to do, thus you have difficulty preparing a checklist, that means you have to revisit your specifications. You didn't write them clearly enough to know what's supposed to be done. And if you can't figure out what to put in the checklist, vendors aren't going to figure out what they have to do, and they're not going to price what they have to do because they're not going to understand it. And if you don't have something that tries to prevent that type of scenario, you're just building in the situation where if you go forward and don't make any clarification, probably you're going to have problems when you're in contract management of the vendor having different interpretation than you do because it simply wasn't clear. So this is a tool to help not only convey to vendors what's supposed to be done, not only convey to whoever's managing the contract when to pay and things of that nature, but when are your specifications clear enough that they are even susceptible to be issued to vendors? So there's a lot of things that come into this contract compliance checklist. That's why we advocate it very strongly. We're not going to do this because we're about a half day behind already, so we're going to just keep pushing through, which is okay, because the main thing is you learn and you're here, you ask questions, and if I'm talking too much, say I'm talking too much. I will take names of anyone who does that, but I'm from the budget department. I know your PIN numbers. Socioeconomic interventions. So we're going to get on this issue, and we touched on this in overview. Let me ask, how many of you have taken the overview? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So only about half of you. Well, see the treat for the other half of you, what you're going to learn in overview. And just for your knowledge, we are giving an overview on December 16th and 17th. For those of you who want to sign up, let me make sure it's the 16th and 17th and not the 17th and 18th.
Or you can wait until it's on the DHMA video.
You can do that, but if I can tell you right now, which I can, December 16th and 17th at Department of Transportation headquarters in Hanover. So I don't know if it's on the website yet, our website, but if it isn't, look for it and you can register to take the overview 2 days, 16th, 17th, Department of Transportation. All right, moving on. Socioeconomic interventions. And in the overview, if I remember correctly, we identify 16 different socioeconomic issues that typically are involved in state procurement contracts. And so I'm going to go and give you some more information about this, because a lot of these things you have to put in the solicitation to begin with. Either you're required to do it or you're not required to do it, but you have the option to do it. And obviously, if you have the option to do it, you must decide, should you do it or should you not do it? And if you want to do it, something has to be done. You have to include an affidavit, you have to include a clause, something has to be done to include it. So now we're going to talk about these socioeconomic interventions. And what they are is conscious attempts to use economic power to promote specific social outcomes that are not objectively a part of the goods or services being procured. What that means is it's not a deliverable you're looking for. It's something that's supposed to benefit the citizens of the state, or a specific segment of the citizens of the state, or humanity in general. And we're using the purchasing power of the state to try to achieve a benefit to society that is not specifically part of that contract. That's what it means. So, you need to determine in the planning stage which socioeconomic considerations apply, which forms or clauses are required versus which are voluntary, which do you have to do, which may you do. Not using the correct form or clause or not properly designating an optional program can cause problems later in procure or perform. Pay me now, pay me later. All right, start with preferred providers. And there are 3 categories of preferred providers. Excuse me, we touched on this a little bit yesterday. And this is the order of the preference of these categories of preferred providers. Number 1 is Maryland Correctional Enterprises, MCE, used to be known as State Use Industries. They are a unit of the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services. They're a state agency. You can contract with them, you can have them do whatever you can get from them, and it's exempt from state procurement. So that's something that many people find attractive. You don't have to do a procurement to use MCE. Nobody has to approve the contract, the Budget Department, Board of Public Works, etc. You can do it. There are people that at times have issues with MCE, as we heard yesterday, but they have a preference. You're supposed to use them. It is not optional. If they provide something, unless you have a waiver from them or unless you have some leeway, typically from general services, to not use them, you are required to use them for what they provide. Second level of preference is Blind Industries and Services of Maryland. And if there's something that MCE does not provide that BISM does provide, you're supposed to use BISM. Third tier of preference is the Employment Works program. And this is a single program that is administered by Maryland Works, and many of you probably have heard of Maryland Works. And there's 2 components, the one that's been there for many, many years and the other one that's only existed about 2 years. And even though it's existed about 2 years, At this point, they only have, we had a presentation in September, I think 4 or 6 vendors that are even participating at this point. So the first one is community service provider. These used to be called sheltered workshops. And if you're with DDA, if you're with Mental Hygiene Administration, you are familiar with the community service providers because they're the vendors that you deal with every day to take care of your clients. They're iScan, they're Melwood, Chimes, on and on and on. There's like 30 or 40 or 50 of the community service providers. So if they can do something that isn't done by MCE or BISM, you're supposed to use the community service providers, except you don't specifically designate a community service provider. You simply send your requirement to Maryland Works, and Maryland Works lets you know whether they have someone that can do it, and that someone could be a community service provider, or it could be an individual with a disability-owned business. And what that is very simple. An individual with a disability who owns a business. And that falls under the same preference as community service providers. But Maryland Works is the entity that decides whether they have somebody and who it's going to be. Yes?
Is there a cap on the expenditure amount?
No.
No?
It can be millions. Now, but the other thing is, this is not an exempt activity. So regardless of the amount of money, you're going to need some approval. You're going to need the same type of contract as with any private entity. Standard terms and conditions, etc. What you don't do is go out and do a competition. See, that's what you typically, let me couch that. Typically, you do not do a competition. You simply contact them and say, here's what I need. And often, here's what I need means you would take the specifications of what you would do a procurement, or you would take the specifications for a previous contract and send it to them. Something you cannot do with a typical private entity, because that would be giving them favoritism, you are required to do with Maryland Works or BISM or MCE. You tell them what you need, and they come back supposedly within, I think, 5 days. I think it's a 5-day leeway where they're supposed to come back to you and say whether they have someone that can provide what you want. Now, you're required to use them if they can provide the same, basically the same level of activity as you would get from anyone else in the private sector. And I know sometimes there's issues of whether they can or whether they can't, and sometimes we give them a lot more than 5 days, as Gary can attest. But you're supposed to go to them first. And if you have, one of the goodies from at least DBM is we have delegated to every agency the ability to contract with a preferred provider who is a non-government entity, which means MCE, since they're exempt, you can go to them regardless, but either BISM or particularly Employment Works program, we have given $200,000 of delegation. So if you're doing something of $200,000 of less, doesn't even come to us. You have the authority to go ahead and make an award. You do the same thing as you would. You get a legally sufficient contract. You have them sign it. And one other issue that has to be gone through for any of these 3 entities is there is a pricing committee, which is chaired by DGS. And so this pricing committee has to approve any proposed activity one of these entities does for you. Now, that doesn't mean they have to do this if you're going to MCE and buying chairs, because those type of things have already been approved. But if you're going for a service, scanning, something like that, or key punching from one of the community service providers, they will identify an entity, they'll come back, give you a price, but they will give you a price that has to be approved by the pricing committee, and after they do, then you sign a contract. Yes?
That's, even if it's under 200,000, it would go to the pricing committee?
If it's a service that has not been pre-approved for the pricing. If it's a commodity type thing where, and this is primarily commodities, talking about MCE, you don't have to go to the pricing committee because they've approved the prices. But if you're going to a service, yeah, the services have to go to the pricing committee, and I think they meet monthly.
Who's the contact for that?
For the pricing committee, you don't have to worry about it. You deal with Maryland Works. If it's the community service provider, they take care of details like that. The only thing you need to worry about is before you go ahead and sign a contract with them, you want to make sure that you will get a letter from, they can give you the letter from the pricing committee that approves the price. And sometimes the question is, well, yes, they've quoted me a price, but it's, from your perspective, a lot higher than you can get it from the private sector. Do you have to pay a higher price? And the answer is yes and no. Which one do you want? If you can afford the higher price, you are supposed to pay it. If you cannot afford the higher price, you do not have to contract for a price that is not affordable to you. But you can't just say, nope, can't afford it, and that's the end of it. You have to give some demonstration that you can't afford it, and then typically you may have to go to the pricing committee to get them, or DGS in this particular instance, to get them to back you that yes, they agree that you can't afford it, and so they basically tell the preferred provider to back off. So there's some complications, but that's generally how it works. Any questions? I can see Gary wants to say something.
Do you want to comment about the board of Public Works with preference providers?
In terms of what? That they like it?
Approvals? Limits?
Approval limits the board? Well, it's the same as anything else, $200,000, over $200,000.
So they still go to the board?
Yes.
You don't get away from that part of it. I just wanted to say two things. One is...
And we're going to be buddies
right,
again.
Right. DGS recently, within the past 7, 8 months, has insisted to all state agencies that they are the initial point of contact for printing. So where it used to be that you went to MCE to get something printed, now you go to Tony Lisby at DGS and you tell him what you want. He is supposed to be the guru, and he will get it printed by MCE or by some other vendor in the time frame that you need, and he will come back to you with a cost estimate. The other thing I wanted to mention is that, and Joel hit on it, we are not obligated to be stupid in these procurements. If you have a budget number for what it is that you're doing, and the entity is over your budget or cannot meet your time requirement, then ask for a waiver. Okay, they may say, show us your budget, and you better have it available for them, or they may say, you know, can't you take it a week later, and you've got to have the reason why you need it then and not a week later. But those are two circumstances where the preferred provider might not be necessary. You'll still have to do a procurement, maybe an email and marketplace type of procurement, but you won't have to be obligated to pay more than what you can afford. The one other thing I wanted to mention, and that's the individual with disability-owned businesses. We are now seeing returning military registering under that category. And where the state has failed to provide a preference for military-owned, former military-owned disabled veterans, I guess is the way to say it, they now get in under this program, and I would encourage you to find out more about that as time goes along and as more of them register. There's one that I know that's coming up that's in the IT field.
And now that Gary has brought that up, and I'm trying to remember this, but I think a law was just passed the last session in the spring that establishes a 0.5% goal for agencies to contract with disabled veteran-owned firms. So I think the implementation is July 1 of 11. So just like you have a goal for MBE, just like to not exactly similar, but to a degree like you have a goal for the small businesses, you will in the future have a 0.5% goal for veterans. And I don't know that it's specifically disabled veterans or just veterans, period. But I'll probably have to check on that. Obviously, I'll have to check on that and incorporate that in one of the classes. But that's going to be something that's going to become in the future. So it's a coming attraction. And hopefully I'll get the details before next Friday so I can tell you categorically what the details are. Yes?
I just wanted to clear up something I thought Gary had said. For instance, if you go through Maryland Works, you don't have to go through eMaryland Marketplace through that, right? You just go directly through them and do a 38.
What Gary was saying, I think what Gary was saying is if you get to the point that you don't end up using a preferred provider, whether it's because of price or time frame or whatever the circumstance is, that then you would go and do what you would normally have done to begin with. Then you go through your normal competition. So is that what you meant?
That is what I meant, and there's also a backwards example on this. I put something out on eMaryland Marketplace about 3 years ago, which was a reproduction of some manuals. And immediately MCE called up and said, "What are you doing that for? That's ours, take it off." All right, well, how much are you going to charge me? We'll get back to you. I did not take it off of eMaryland Marketplace. I got my numbers back. The charge from Maryland Works was, as I recall, $26,000, something like that. The charge from Staples was around $11,000. I asked the agency what their budget was, and oddly enough, it was something like $11,000 or $12,000. And I discussed it with MCE, and they couldn't meet that price. And I don't believe I got a formal waiver, but we did buy it for less money. And that's an example I'm trying to get across about doing something smart, and we should do it legally. Please don't misinterpret what I'm saying. But if you don't get a waiver and your time is fleeting, send them an email and say, are you going to meet this price? Are you going to be able to deliver it on time? We're getting into a bind, and then do what you have to do under good procurement responsibilities to get your item.
Okay. One caveat.
One caveat.
You're not supposed to go out and do a procurement and then go to the preferred providers and say, here's your target, this is what you have to meet. They are supposed to have the preference. Sometimes it will be an activity that you don't know they do. And so it's an activity, you'll do a procurement and they'll learn about it and they will come to you. Sometimes they won't come to you, they'll simply complain to general services or the governor's office that you didn't give them the opportunity. And other times, if it's something that's new that they decide they might want to do, they might tell you, go ahead and do a procurement anyway, let's find out how much it costs, and then we'll see if we can match the price you're going to get from the public sector. But there's a downside to you doing a competition that allows the private sector to respond, with them going through the time and effort to do a response, and then in the end result, it goes to one of the preferred providers because they have the preference. That definitely irritates the people in the private sector. So that's supposed to be only under very narrow circumstances where you do a procurement and still end up going to a preferred provider.
Right, and we did have this.
Point counterpoint.
we did have this in a very active manner, where we had a data entry contract, a lot of it with Medicaid, and Maryland Works was annoyed that we had it out for the private sector. They said, well, we can do that, and we said, have you ever done it before the way we want it done? No, we haven't. So it took about a year for them finally to issue us a waiver. And when we stopped the procurement, but then put it back out with the caveat that any offeror on this procurement should know that it may be required by the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene to award this to a preference provider. So we tried to be upfront with those vendors. We got back 2 or 3 bids, offers, and as it turned out, Maryland Works dropped out, and one of those offerors was the awardee. So, but it can get complicated. It can get time sensitive. It definitely gets into politics. I was getting calls from people who I never heard of.
And people he did hear of,
People I did hear of.
such as people standing right next to him.
Right. Do you want to reconsider this?
Well, we didn't say, do you want to? We said, back off.
So we did until it was proven that we were right in the first place, but we spent a year doing it.
That makes no difference. Just because you're right doesn't mean you should do it. Yeah, in that particular instance, it was an example of where even though 5 days is a time frame when they have nominally, it's not something that has to be applied. I said yesterday, Assessments and Taxation did a contract that had like a 6-month pilot, and one thing I can say is the Board of Public Works likes items coming to them for preferred providers. They think you're doing a good job. And so they praised Assessments and Taxation for their pilot, and I think they were even kind of congratulatory to DHMH with taking the 6 months or more to see whether Maryland Works could do that particular project. It got into some sticky situations when we being myself and Mike Hafley over at DGS, tried to dissuade Maryland Works from going to the governor's office and complaining. And so we tried to broker some agreement under the circumstances. Best thing is just know what the rules are, follow the rules, and plan to follow the rules. Okay, we're going to move on. Small business programs. There are 2 types of small business programs. One, specifically you at DHMH can use, and those of you in the environment, you can use this. And the other one that for the most part you cannot use, but you can under very narrow circumstances. And those of you from the Department of Budget Management, you can't use that either. You can't use the first one. So thing for you to know is there's 2 programs. There is a preference, there is a reserve, and we're going to go through both of those. And the reason we're going through them is because neither one happens automatically. So you have to make a decision, number one, can you apply it? And then if you can apply it, should you apply it? Do you want to? That's part of planning. So they are not available for use by all agencies, do not apply automatically. That's redundancy. I ought to read these slides before I talk. They only apply if the solicitation specifically states that one or the other applies. If it's not in your solicitation, it doesn't exist. It doesn't make any difference what you could have done. If you didn't put it in there, you didn't do it. In the planning stage, it must be decided if there are a sufficient number of qualified certified small businesses, if a sufficient number of qualified certified small businesses are available, and whether a given agency has, number one, the legal authority to use the program or the financial ability to pay more than the lowest bid amount, because that's what one of them specifically means. You're going to give a preference from a price standpoint. All right, we're going to start with the preference. It is limited to usage by Transportation, Morgan, Public Safety for prison construction, and the Department of General Services. The agencies, and here's the thing that drilling down, potentially everyone in this room can use this, but you can only use it in a narrow context. Agencies conducting procurements under delegation from DGS may also use this preference for delegated commodity or maintenance procurements. So if you're doing a service, you can't give, if you're with environment, if you're with health and mental hygiene, you cannot give a small business preference because you have no legal status to do that. But if you're doing a commodity purchase, since all commodities are under DGS, even if they delegate to you, what, 25,000, 50,000?
25 commodities, 50 men.
25,000. So if you're going out and doing a commodity purchase, which if you drill down is under the delegation from DGS, you can do what DGS can do, which means you can have a small business preference in your commodity procurement. So that's the only circumstance where environment or DHMH can apply the small business preference. And let me tell you what the small business preference is. Can only be used for competitive sealed bidding. It is a price preference, and so it applies where price is the determinant of an award. And since competitive sealed bidding includes multi-step, it can be for either multi-step sealed bidding or normal competitive sealed bidding. Let's see. And if you go to 21110105B2, there's where you'll find the clause that is suggested to include in your solicitation if you have the authority to use the preference and you want to use the preference. Under a small business preference, there is no restriction on who can submit bids. You can get bids from small businesses and you can get bids from non-small businesses. It is a price preference only, and the preference cannot exceed 5%, but it can be less than 5%. So in addition to designating by using the clause, if you have this in a commodity procurement, you must say in the solicitation what percentage preference will you allow. Is it going to be 5? Is it going to be 4? Is it going to be 3? Is it going to be half of 1%? So everyone knows what the preference is. Then you have the 5% small business preference, and now we have a piggybacking effect. You can allow an additional 2% preference if it is a small veteran-owned business. So you can now have a 7% preference, a 5% for small business period, and 2% for a veteran-owned small business. And then you can go one better and you can give an additional 1% preference if the veteran-owned business is owned by a disabled veteran. So you can have 5% for the small business, plus 2% for the veteran, plus an additional 1% if you're applying the disabled veteran-owned small business preference. So you can get up to a maximum of 8% that you can give under preferences under the small business program. Again, only for commodities, only under sealed bidding. And, okay, so this is what this says. So there could be 7% for small veteran and 8% for small veteran disabled.
You said that's only for commodities.
That's only for things under those specific agencies. Transportation can do it for construction. But for what you can use at DHMH or the environment, since you're not transportation, you're not public safety, you're not Morgan University, the only way you can use this is if you're doing something under the purview of DGS, which is commodities and maintenance. So if you want to, and the thing to keep in mind, under the next thing we're going to talk about, the Small Business Reserve, both DHMH and the environment are agencies that are supposed to give 10% of their total awards to small businesses. You can use the preference as a means to help get to that 10% overall award status. So even if you don't reserve something, which we're going to go through in a moment, what the Small Business Reserve is, so even if you don't put something in the Small Business Reserve, you can give for a maintenance or commodity activity the preference, still with the goal of getting an award to a small business that you can then count as part of your required 10% going to small businesses. Is that clear? Got that? All right, moving on. So continuing with what the preference means. If a large business, so we're going, let's say you had, I think we used the 5%, oh no, we used 3% in the example. If you get responses from both a large business, i.e. not a small business, and small businesses, and the lowest bid is from other than a small business, and you also have bids from small businesses, so that you have the potential to apply the preference, here's how you decide who wins. And we starting with the premise that the large business, not a small business, is the lowest bidder. Do they win? Well, maybe they do and maybe they don't. It depends. If you in your solicitation have given and said, even though you could give 5%, you only said we're going to give 3% in your solicitation, and you have, just for the sake of simplicity, a bid from a non-small business that is $100,000, just an even $100,000, and that is the lowest bid. And you also have a bid from a small business, a qualified small business, that is, in that example, $102,900. I have no idea why I picked $102,900, just seemed to be a nice number. And you say to yourself, okay, low bid was $100,000. I'm giving a 3% preference. 3% of $100,000 is $3,000. Add the $3,000 to the $100,000. That means a small business that bids less than $103,000 beats a bid from a non-small business that's anything less than $103,000. That's what the preference means. Whether you say you subtract it from the small business or however you say it, you use this mechanism to decide whether the small business would win when you apply the preference. If you did not have a small business that bid less than $103,000, the large business still wins, because even with applying a 3% preference, it's still not within the necessary ballpark. If you have only large businesses that bid, you don't have to worry about it. If you have only small businesses that bid, you don't give a further preference within the small businesses. So it's only small versus large if you have it in your solicitation. Any questions on how you would apply that? And if you gave the veterans preferences, and you could say up to 8%, and you follow the same mechanism. You could have $100,000 from a non-veteran owned small business and $107,000 from a veteran owned small preference, and you would give it to the veteran owned if you had allowed all the 8% that was permissible. That's how it works. But if you don't put it in your specifications, it doesn't work at all, because it doesn't exist, even though you could have. So that's what the rest of that says. All right. I've said that already. All right. Theoretically, there could be a situation when the lowest preference bid price is deemed unaffordable. Presumably in this situation, the lowest absolute price would also be unaffordable. Accordingly, all bids could be rejected. And if you rejected them, you could do it again without applying the preference. This is an extreme situation, just showing that you could end up starting with the procurement with a preference. You end up not awarding, and because you now decide that now that you see what the prices were, you decide you can't afford to give the preference anymore, you could reissue it without the preference. So consult your AAG and higher management before eliminating the preference, because that looks bad. If you do a procurement with a preference and then turn around and do a procurement without the preference, just make sure you have the okay from higher ups before you do it. Yes?
These would be for solicitations as far as DHMH that would have to go through DGS.
Well, if they're going through DGS,
They would be the ones.
they would make the decision, probably in consultation with you. What we're talking about here for your specific situation is where they delegate it to you, that you don't have to go back to them, that you have the authority to make the award. And I don't know whether you have to report it to them or what you have to do.
Never done them.
You've never reported it, or you've never used?
I'm not aware of us having done any procurement under the small business.
Okay. But you can. And if Beverly Spence is beating on you because you're not doing the 10% small business overall for DHMH or whoever does it for the environment, you can say, okay, we'll go ahead and start using the small preference to the degree we can, and maybe we'll get a 10% up. Or the other thing you're going to say is, my budget's been cut, I can't even afford what I need to buy, I can't spend 1 cent more than I have to, and you don't apply the preference. So that's part of what you have to decide. Now we go to the small business reserve. Any questions about small business preference? Small business reserve is limited to use by 23 agencies, and both Environment and DHMH are 2 of those 23 agencies.
So before you get into that, maybe, I don't know if you talk about it later, you mentioned reciprocal preferences.
Do I mention it? No.
Would you like to mention?
Can I say no? Reciprocal preference is not something that you have an option to put in or not put in. It is a required clause. And reciprocal preference means that you are putting vendors who are located out of state on notice that if they respond to your solicitation and if they are otherwise going to be the apparent awardee, and there is a response from a Maryland firm. So you have at least one out-of-state firm that is in the position to win, and at least one Maryland firm that also responded. Before you make an award, before you seek to make an award, you are supposed to find out whether the out-of-state entity is located in a state, or the out-of-state entity can include Washington, D.C., or can include New York City, something like that, that has a preference that would work against a Maryland vendor if they were bidding in that government's jurisdiction. And reciprocal preference simply means I'm going to do against a vendor from your state what your state would do against a vendor from Maryland. We're going to reciprocate with any preference that you have. So even though we're not going to say we're going to give a point preference or a price preference or anything else, if a Maryland firm would not win in your state because your home state vendor is given an X% preference, when they bid in Maryland, we're going to give that same preference to the Maryland firm against the firm from your state. So I mentioned I don't deal with that in this class because it's a mandatory clause that you don't have the option to include or not include. And even if for some reason you didn't include it, since it is required by law, you would still be required to do it. You would still be authorized to abide by that law because you're required to do it. And if you're required to do something, the absence of putting it in solicitation does not mean it isn't there. It's read into it anyway. So the reality is that usually that doesn't achieve anything because most states have now gone to this same type of situation so that they don't establish in-state preferences, so there's nothing for you to reciprocate against. The one thing I will say is the last I checked, Washington, D.C. did have 3 types of preferences for D.C.-based firms. So if you have a bidder or an offerer from Washington, D.C. that is winning over a Maryland firm, you definitely need to look at the D.C. preferences and see if that makes a difference if you would apply that for the Maryland firm. And I know of at least one instance when doing that changed the award. It went from a D.C.-based firm to a Maryland-based firm because they applied the preference that D.C. would have applied against the Maryland-based firm. But most of the time it doesn't apply, and if you want to know what the preferences are for other states, you go to the Board of Public Works website, look under Board Advisories. There's an advisory on reciprocal preference. If you go to that advisory, there is a link to the state of Texas, some particular agency in the state of Texas, and Texas has gone out and done an exhaustive listing of all the preferences of all the states and all the localities, and they list it. And since Texas has done it, we don't need to go out and reinvent the wheel. We can just go to Texas website, the one that's on the link, and find out if the vendor is from Pennsylvania, what preferences does Pennsylvania have. So, does that answer your question?
What about out of the country bidders?
Out of the country bidders? Is there a preference against them?
Yeah.
So we did receive one out of country.
I guess if you read the reciprocal preference, it says the locality in which the other business is located. So I guess you could apply it against an out-of-state, out-of-country vendor. That probably would not show up on the Texas website as what their preference is. I've never had that situation. I mean, I know of a couple instances where vendors from Canada have won procurements, but I don't think there was ever an issue of reciprocal preference in that situation.
I just had a question. Isn't one of the stipulations the headquarters location, not just simply where they're located out of state?
The requirement is, when you talk about out-of-state vendor, the location from which they are headquartered has their principal place of business or the principal location from which they would provide the service required by your solicitation, the service or the good. And that came about because there was a procurement about 7, 8 years ago by I think it was the Aviation Administration for weather equipment for the airport, for BWI Airport. And there were bids from a firm that was headquartered in, I want to say Massachusetts, and one from a firm that was headquartered in Maryland. And Massachusetts did not have a preference, but the equipment was actually made in Ohio, and Ohio did have a preference. And so at that time, I think it was the controller, who I think at that time was Schaefer, objected to the award to the firm headquartered in Massachusetts manufacturing the equipment in Ohio instead of the Maryland firm, because if you applied the Ohio preference, the Maryland firm would have won. And applying the non-existent Massachusetts preference didn't change the award going to the out-of-state vendor. And so what they ultimately had to have is the Office of the Attorney General come in with an opinion that they could not apply the then existing law to the preference of Ohio because the law didn't allow that. And then the next legislative session, the law was changed to allow the principal location from which the good or service will be provided, specifically so if that situation ever happened again, they could apply the Ohio preference and win to a Maryland firm. So, all of which doesn't happen in planning. Okay, small business reserve. It can be used by the 23 agencies listed in a couple of slides and cannot be used by any other agency. If you're not among the 23 listed, you can't elect to use this. It is not permissive. You have to follow the law, which says you can't restrict who can respond. And it can be done for any competitive procurement, either sealed bidding or sealed proposal, or theoretically if you had other than those procurement methods. Only small businesses are permitted to submit a bid or proposal. So under the preference, a non-small business could respond. If you give a small business reserve, it's reserving the procurement for only small businesses, so only they can respond. If a non-small business is dumb enough to submit a bid or proposal, as soon as you find out they're not a small business, you say, you're eliminated. I cannot award to you, so I'm not going to do anything because I cannot award to you. You're not a small business. Only small businesses are permitted to submit a bid or proposal, so only a small business can win. No price or other preference applies among the responding small businesses because you're not favoring any small business over any other small business. Yes?
If you have the DGS does a statewide contract for a commodity and it's designated SBR only and it comes in above your budget, are you still required to buy off of it?
If it's question is, DGS does a procurement. DGS, since they're one of the agencies that can delegate something as a small business reserve, was this either preference or reserve?
No, it was reserve.
Reserve. If they do it under the small business reserve and they make an award and they have prices, and those, in your situation, I guess what you're saying is the prices are higher than you know you could have gotten if a small business was not the one to win. Most, if not all, DGS contracts are mandatory for you to use. So that means they're mandatory for you to use. So for you to not use it, you would have to go to them and see whether there's any way that they can give you leeway not to use it, but otherwise you decide to either buy under the contract or do without. I think that's the simple answer to your question.
And just an update, I asked Mike Hafley about must use versus may use on some of his contracts.
Yeah?
And he said that his maintenance contracts were not must use contracts.
Okay. Commodities are must use, maintenance are not must use, they're may use. So that depends. If it's something that General Services under their internal policy requires all agencies to use their statewide contracts, if they require it, you have to use it. You don't have leeway. But apparently they do not necessarily designate every contract they have as something that is mandatory. The other thing I can say is they have changed or will change their policy when they have used an intergovernmental cooperative purchase to award a contract. And I think they're giving you some leeway for intergovernmental cooperative purchasing that you don't necessarily have to use it. But that's something that you'd have to check with them, because that's something that there was legislation submitted to change it, and they got the legislation to be withdrawn, but in exchange they said, we'll change our policy to allow something to happen. And since I don't do commodity or maintenance procurements, I don't know whether they did it.
The specific example that you're talking about, I think, was the auto parts.
It was auto parts, yes.
Contract where the award went to AutoZone, and all the other automotive part companies were griping about it.
In Maryland.
In Maryland. And Mike Hafley had some negative, and DGS had some negative press about that.
Oh, yeah.
The legislation, I think, was there, but didn't go through, and I have not formally been told that we can use whomever we want on auto parts. So we continue to use AutoZone.
Well, there's something called a Procurement Advisory Council that meets 4 times a year, and at the Procurement Advisory Council about 9 months ago, attended by at least one state delegate, the state delegate who sponsored the legislation that actually he didn't sponsor it in exchange for the agreement made at the PAC meeting that DGS was going to do this. So I don't know whether DGS did it. So you can check. Maybe Gary can check. Maybe I'll check and try to find out by next week. All right, we'll try to finish this in about 8 minutes. Small Business Reserve. If you're one of the 23 agencies, you are required by law to award 10% of the total dollar value of all your procurements, except for the asterisks. There's 2 exclusions from all your dollar value of awards to small businesses. And small businesses as a prime contractor, i.e. you cannot establish a subcontracting relationship, and you cannot have the same thing that you have for an MBE, that you have a prime who subcontracts a portion to an MBE. A non-small business cannot subcontract to a small business and have any such subcontracting count as part of this 10%. It has to be direct from DHMH or the environment to a small business, regardless of how you made that award. You can make it under a reserve program, you can make it under a preference program, you can make it as an emergency, as a regular procurement, as a small procurement, however you do it. If an award ends up going to a small business, it can be counted towards the 10% requirement. The exclusion is any money that you spend with preferred providers, you don't count that as the universe that you have to spend 10% with small businesses. Another reason to go to preferred providers. And here in the health department, you spend more than $100 million a year with preferred providers, mostly through DDA and Mental Hygiene Administration. So that $100 million is not part of the equation of what 10% has to be given with small businesses. So just a little advantage to that. And the other one, which I've never seen happen, but if a procurement is funded by a federal agency and that federal agency prohibits the inclusion in the solicitation of a small business reserve, then you are allowed to not count the award with those federal dollars from what you have to have the overall 10% dollar value of. And that applies mainly for, I think, some highway construction and things like that. And I'm not even sure whether transportation has ever had this issue of a prohibition from the federal government. But other than those two exceptions, 10% of what you spend by law is supposed to go to small businesses, however you get it to them. And a way that you can specifically get it to them is a small business reserve. And so, let's see, talked about that. Can be through any mechanism, reserving, preference, target outreach, like in small procurements, etc. Using the corporate purchasing card, that's all countable. DGS maintains a small business self-certification program via the DGS website. Excuse me. So if someone wants to register as a small business, they simply go to the DGS website, they click on Small Business Reserve, they go and they do a self-application. Supposedly it takes less than an hour to complete it, and they're now under the Small Business Reserve program, self-certified. But before awarding a contract under the Small Business Reserve program, the procurement officer should verify that the apparent awardee is certified by the Department of General Services as a small business. So there's a little bit of an issue that is not totally clarified as to whether only a vendor that's already on the small business website can even respond to a small business reserve procurement. The general answer is they don't have to be registered to respond. That's not an absolute, but that's the general answer. But what is an absolute answer is before you say to any of them, you win, you need to go to the DGS website and make sure they're on there as a certified small business. And if they're not, then you say to them, well, you would have won, but you're not certified. And if they say, oh, how do I get certified? And how long does it take? And you can say to them, well, you go to the DGS website, it takes about 40 minutes. And they say, can you wait and not make another award for 40 minutes? And if you say yes, then, and they go register, and they're registered before you make an award, that is okay. And I know Gary has a contrary opinion because...
No, that was
At one time, Gary had a contrary opinion.
One time I did, but the reason I had a contrary opinion was because we had a gripe from a small business who said, I never saw the solicitation. Well, you never saw it because you weren't registered on eMaryland, and it's not my obligation to go through the phone book and look for small businesses to send it to you. So that's why you weren't able to bid on it. I would, if the low-cost responsive and responsible bidder was not registered, I would call them up. I would give them a reasonable amount of time to register under the small business program. It's really simple, and if they don't, then they don't. You go on to the next person. One more thing about small business reserve at OPAS. We've taken the position that all procurements that we see automatically are small business reserve unless it can be proven to us that there are not enough small businesses capable of providing the product or service. And then we will simply issue a waiver to the entity doing the solicitation. So we take that position right from the beginning. And even having taken that position, yesterday I signed our small business report that goes to GOMA. We were at 4.53%, so we've got a ways to go. Now, good side of it, last year we were at 4.11%. If you want to spin it, it's a 10% increase. But, I mean, we still have a ways to go on small businesses. So keep that in mind when you're using your credit cards or doing your eMaryland Marketplace. It's very simple to specify this only goes to small businesses.
Okay. Yes? And let's just finish this, and then we'll take the lunch break, and we'll do an hour from when we actually leave.
you have to be certain in my mind. If you got a small business, a contract out there and you get accepted and it's for small business only, and the person who win it is not registered, you can tell it they've been registered?
Yes. The question is, he just wants to make clear, if you put this solicitation out there and you're going to put it through the same advertising mechanism, email and marketplace, for instance, you can't guarantee who's going to respond, even though you had small business reserve language. And so if someone responds and they're going to be the winner and you check and they're not registered with DGS, can you tell them that I can only award to you if you go and get registered? Yes, you can tell them that. Now, obviously, when they go and register, the next thing that's implicit is they are truthful and they only fill out things that when they're, at the end of the day, they're going to be certified because they are income limits, and they'll say they're within those limits. And if they're not, then they should not complete the registration. They should not be certified. Yes?
And that was my question. Are we basing the award on that website? Is that the only thing we have to do is go out and see that they are on the website?
Yes, I think, let me see, I don't say that. Okay. The issue for you is check the DGS website. If they're not there, you cannot award to them. You can give them the opportunity, as Gary said, a reasonable time, whether that's a half day, since you know it only takes about 40 minutes. Is by tomorrow reasonable? That's up to you. And as long as they get registered, and when you go back and check, if you say, I'll give you until the end of the day tomorrow, and then you check at 8 o'clock the following day, and they're registered, then they're registered. They're certified. But if you check then and they're still not registered, you can say, c'est la vie, I gave you the chance. Now, the other thing that comes into play is occasionally you make an award to a vendor who is registered, regardless of when they got registered, and when other vendors who bid or submit a proposal find out who won, they say, well, I know them. They're not a small business. They basically challenge this self-certification. They say, I know they can't be within the income limit that is required to be a small business. If that happens, then you are supposed to go to DGS and let them know that there has been a challenge of the small business status, and DGS is supposed to contact that small business and now say, give me the documentation that what you put on our website is correct. Give me your tax returns for the past 3 years, which demonstrate that your income, and if you're talking about a service, it's an average of 10 million or less per year. So I need to see from your tax returns, not anything else, but what you filed with the federal government, federal income tax, that you are reporting less than an average of $10 million a year for the past 3 years. And if they submit those tax returns and they demonstrate it, they stay on the rolls. If they submit the tax returns and it shows their income was an average of 12 million, DGS will drop them. They cannot make an award to them. And I know of one circumstance where DGS refusing to certify a vendor was appealed to the Board of Contract Appeals, and the Board of Contract Appeals upheld DGS's determination the vendor was not a small business. Break time. Or do you have a question? Question. Then we'll have break time.
You're saying go on, check, and see if they've been registered, you give them a certain amount of time. Are you going on e-Maryland or are you going on FEMA?
You're neither one. You're going to the DGS website for the Small Business Reserve Program. Okay. So it is not e-Maryland Marketplace.
It's already updated the minute that they're registered.
When they complete the registration, they're on there, yes. Okay, so come back around 5 after 1.